Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On July 17th, 1990, a blue Dodge Caravan was found neatly parked in a Kmart lot in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. It wasn't crashed. It wasn't ransacked. The keys weren't in the ignition, but everything else was in place. A backpack rested on the front seat. A half-empty cup from Burger King sat in the console. A makeup bag, a notebook. No sign of struggle, no broken glass. But there was one thing missing. Beck, the 18-year-old who owned the van. At first glance, it didn't look like a crime scene. That was the problem. Barrett wasn't a runaway. She was on her way to a computer class in Appleton, a summer certification program designed for college-bound students with academic promise. She had only been driving for about an hour when she disappeared somewhere along U.S. Highway 41 between her hometown of Sturtevant and Appleton. According to timestamp receipts, she stopped at a fast food restaurant for lunch just after noon. That was the last confirmed activity linked to her. She never arrived at her destination. She never came home. Her parents contacted local authorities later that afternoon. A missing persons report was filed by evening. The case wasn't immediately treated as high risk. She was legally an adult, and at that point, there was no evidence of foul play. But the location of the van, abandoned, untouched, and in a high-traffic area, raised internal flags among detectives. There was a gap between behavior and outcome that couldn't be explained away. The vehicle was processed by technicians the next morning. Prints were lifted. Receipts, wrappers, and hair strands were cataloged. The van itself showed no damage. The doors were locked, but the driver's side window had been left slightly cracked, common for short stops on warm days. Her suitcase and toiletries were in the back. It looked like she had stopped briefly, maybe gone into the store, and never returned. But no one at Kmart remembered seeing her. Surveillance footage at the time was either non-existent or had already been recorded over. Investigators canvassed local businesses, employees, and shoppers. A few vague sightings came in. A young woman who might have matched Barrett's description walking toward a nearby lot, or possibly entering a restroom, but nothing substantial enough to confirm. Meanwhile, her bank cards remained untouched. Her phone, a landline connection to home, as cell phones weren't common, remained unanswered. That, more than anything else, disturbed her parents. On July 19th, 2 days after her disappearance, the van was officially declared a vehicle of interest. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it didn't. No fingerprints could be definitively matched. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of forced entry. It was too clean. Forensic specialists noted an inconsistency in dust patterns on the passenger side door. It looked wiped, one analyst wrote in the report, but only in a narrow vertical path. The implication? Someone opened that door recently. Inside the cup holder were two items that shouldn't have been there: a cigarette pack and a plastic lid from a second fast food cup. Barrett didn't smoke, and her family confirmed she never drank soda from Burger King. She preferred juice. Still, none of it pointed definitively to an abduction. A week later, a K-9 search team was deployed along the highway corridor, retracing the route from Sturtevant to Fond du Lac. No scent trails were found. Flyers went up. Press conferences were held, but the evidence was still circumstantial, and without a body and or signs of trauma, the case remained stalled. It became one of those Midwest mysteries, unsettling, quiet, and frustratingly vague. In Fond du Lac, investigators began quietly referring to it as the van that waited for her to come back, waited for someone to notice, waited without answers. And then, 43 days later, answers came from a roadside ditch near Wupun. On August 29, 1990, 43 days after Barrett Beck vanished, her body was discovered in a drainage ditch off Highway 49, just outside Wupun, Wisconsin. The location was rural, unlit, and partially concealed by tall grass and late summer overgrowth. A local farm worker operating a roadside mower saw what he initially thought was debris. It wasn't. The body was partially clothed. The decomposition was advanced. The remains were positioned face down, arms tucked unnaturally beneath the torso. No purse. No ID. Dental records later confirmed the identity. It was Barrett. Fond du Lac County deputies arrived within an hour. The scene was cordoned off. Photographs were taken. Measurements were logged. The temperature that day was 81 degrees Fahrenheit. Soil beneath the body was dry, but there was evidence of prior disturbance. Crushed vegetation around the immediate area suggested the body had been dragged several feet off the road and left deliberately concealed. Initial analysis estimated that the remains had been at the site for at least 3 to 4 weeks. That meant Barrett had likely been killed within days, possibly hours after her disappearance. No weapon was recovered. No ligatures were found. However, a strip of light-colored cloth was wrapped tightly across the upper face and eyes. The coroner would later note petechial hemorrhaging consistent with asphyxiation. The discovery of the cloth changed the nature of the case. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a voluntary disappearance. This was now a homicide. The body was transported to the state crime lab in Madison for post-mortem examination. Toxicology was limited due to decomposition. No alcohol, no known drugs. Cause of death was listed as homicidal violence consistent with manual or ligature strangulation. The examiner noted that while soft tissue was compromised, there was no skeletal trauma, no fractures, no indications of prolonged beating. The killing appeared direct and efficient. From a forensic standpoint, several observations were notable. No insects were found within the mouth or nasal cavity, suggesting the cloth had been applied before or shortly after death. Clothing was intact, with no signs of tearing or struggle. A foreign hair, light-colored, coarse, possibly male, was located on the waistband of the victim's jeans. It was bagged and preserved. At the time, no DNA profile could be extracted. Deputies conducted grid searches of the surrounding area. Nothing was recovered apart from a flattened cigarette filter and a candy wrapper several feet from the ditch line. Their relevance remained inconclusive. Investigators cross-referenced local missing persons and sex offender registries. There was no immediate match. The disposal method was calculated off a quiet highway, not close enough to any visible residence, yet accessible from the main road. Someone had known where to go. Someone had done this before, or thought through the risk carefully. One detective noted in his field report, "She wasn't just dumped. She was placed, positioned with intent to delay discovery." The cloth was submitted for fiber analysis. The results indicated a polyester blend, commonly found in household cleaning rags. It didn't belong to Barrett. It didn't match anything from the van. It came from somewhere else entirely. Back in Fond du Lac, the case shifted rapidly. The discovery of a body gave law enforcement legal and procedural latitude they didn't have before. Full search warrants were issued. Witnesses were re-interviewed. The van was reprocessed. In parallel, community reaction intensified. Flyers were replaced with memorial posters. A vigil was held on the courthouse steps. What was once a missing persons case now required a suspect. But here's what complicated everything. There were no signs that Barrett had ever left the Kmart lot alive. No confirmed sightings, no known communications, no receipts or transactions beyond that last fast food stop. That meant the killer likely engaged her at or near the van. That meant the killer may have entered the van. And yet, no one saw a thing. From the outside, it looked like a girl walked away. From the inside, the silence was screaming. A forensic profiler brought in later would quietly observe, this was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of opportunity executed with control. And control leaves traces, just not always where you expect them. By early September 1990, the recovery of Barrett Beck's body shifted the case into active homicide status. As the medical examiner finalized the cause of death, Fond du Lac County investigators returned to the van, the initial scene. What had once been treated as a missing persons vehicle was now potential evidence in a murder. That required a second look, this time under different legal authority and with elevated urgency. The van had been impounded since July. Its original search had followed standard missing person protocol. Items logged, fingerprints lifted, surface photographs taken. But without a confirmed crime, no extensive invasive forensics had been authorized. That changed the moment the word homicide appeared in the coroner's report. Now the vehicle was reprocessed using procedures appropriate for a crime scene. The interior was dismantled, the seats removed, the carpeting pulled back. This wasn't precautionary, it was strategic. The goal was simple: find something missed the first time, Technicians focused on three primary areas: touch DNA and trace evidence collection, latent prints from non-porous surfaces not previously dusted, residue detection beneath the seat wells and rear cargo panel. This time, results surfaced. First, under the front passenger seat, a partial smudge not documented in the initial processing was uncovered. It was too distorted for visual matching but viable for chemical extraction. The swab was preserved for later testing. Technology in 1990 couldn't extract a DNA profile from degraded skin cells, but it was logged as potentially useful. This item wouldn't be actionable until over a decade later. Second, forensic vacuuming of the carpet yielded 4 human hairs. 3 were later matched to Barrett through mitochondrial DNA. 1 remained unidentified. It was coarse, blonde, and lacking a root, rendering nuclear DNA comparison impossible at the time. The hair was bagged and marked for indefinite storage. Third, and most critically, a new technician reviewing the inventory noted a conflict between the original photograph set and the evidence log. The fast food drink cup from the front console had been recorded, but the plastic lid had not. In one frame, the lid was visibly present. In another, taken later, it was gone. It was unclear whether it had been mishandled or overlooked. What mattered was that it hadn't been tested. That cup lid, found during a secondary sweep near the van's original impound storage, was immediately processed. The material retained partial ridge detail, a fingerprint fragment. At the time, there was no match in national databases. The print was archived, coded, and filed away. Procedurally, this chapter of the investigation reflects a broader reality in law enforcement. Early assumptions limit scope. In missing person cases, evidence is approached cautiously, often under constraints that favor privacy and due process. Once a death is ruled a homicide, those constraints shift. This case exemplified how critical early misclassifications can delay resolution. Back in the department conference room, lead detectives and analysts compiled a revised timeline based on the forensic evidence now available. Using itemized receipts, timestamp logs, and estimated time of death parameters, the working theory was restructured. Barrett was last seen alive around 1 p.m. on July 17th. Her body, in the condition it was found, likely had been placed in the ditch within 48 hours of her disappearance. This compressed the window of opportunity for the offender. Whoever committed the crime had acted quickly, with a level of planning not characteristic of impulsive violence. They knew how to avoid cameras. They left little trace. They operated within a 2-day window, and they got away with it. Despite the narrowed timeline, the forensic discoveries didn't yet point to a name. No suspect, no confession, just artifacts, hair, partial prints, chemical traces, waiting for science to catch up. In small communities like Fond du Lac, the psychological impact of open-ended murder cases is disproportionate. These aren't anonymous cities. The streets, businesses, and families intersect. When a case remains unresolved, it doesn't just haunt one household, it leaves residue on the entire town. Barrett's family, now past the shock of loss, began organizing annual events in her name. Donation drives for student technology programs, memorial vigils. They stayed out of the press as much as they could, but privately they continued to send letters to the department every few months. Not accusations, just quiet reminders. As winter approached, case activity slowed. The reprocessing of the van had reached its limits, at least with the tools available. The department filed all new evidence under a cold case tag and marked the timeline as paused. One detective, years later, would put it bluntly in a training lecture. The answers were there. We just didn't have the tech or the context to see them. For the next 2 decades, the murder of Barrett Beck sat in the cold case file system of Fond du Lac County. Not closed, just unmovable. The physical evidence from the van, the scene, and the body remained stored and preserved. None of it matched any suspect on record. Leads went quiet. Detectives rotated. Technology changed, but the case didn't. The items cataloged from the reprocessed van, partial fingerprint, unidentified hair, touch DNA, were forwarded to the state lab, then later entered into national systems as those databases expanded. But nothing returned. No hits, no match, no momentum. Barrett's case was revisited occasionally by new personnel or during departmental audits. Each time, the review followed the same pattern: timeline confirmation, scene documentation, suspect profiles rechecked. All points led back to the same conclusion. The case had been well documented, but was missing one critical element: identity. The killer had left almost nothing behind. Almost. In 2006, Wisconsin's DOJ announced expanded use of the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFS, capable of comparing partials with improved algorithmic sensitivity. The partial from Barrett's case was flagged for reevaluation. The print was digitally rescanned and uploaded again. Still, no match. But that rescan was essential because it preserved the print in the system at a higher resolution. That one step would later prove decisive. In 2009, a retired detective who had once worked the Beck case joined a newly formed cold case task force. While reviewing unsolved homicides by forensic viability, he flagged Barrett's case as high potential based on preserved evidence integrity and advances in DNA. That same year, the Wisconsin Crime Lab began implementing probabilistic genotyping software, allowing analysis of degraded samples previously deemed inconclusive. The smudge beneath the front passenger seat, swabbed in 1990, was re-entered into testing. It returned partial male DNA, too weak for an individual profile, but strong enough for exclusion analysis. Hundreds of known offenders were run against it, none matched. In 2012, a legislative grant enabled Fond du Lac County to submit cold case materials to private forensic labs for deeper testing. The unidentified blonde hair found in the van was extracted again. This time, mitochondrial DNA sequencing was successful. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's mitochondrial database. It still didn't identify a person, but it narrowed ancestry, regional origin, and confirmed the hair came from a male. That was enough to shift the case status from inactive to under review. Internally, there was debate. Some believed the forensic markers were too weak to push the case forward. Others argued that cold cases were exactly where modern forensics should be focused. The debate ended when a quiet directive came down: submit every remaining item from the Beck case to full digital reanalysis. No assumptions, no shortcuts. The fingerprint lid was scanned again, now with AFIS Level 3 pattern recognition, enabling ridge detail and pressure sequence interpretation. It revealed enough distinguishing characteristics to qualify for full comparison under new guidelines. And in 2014, after 24 years, that fingerprint hit. The match wasn't local. It wasn't someone previously linked to Barrett. It belonged to a man in Kenosha County, booked on unrelated charges. His prints had only recently been digitized. He wasn't family. He wasn't a friend. There was no logical reason his fingerprint should have been in the front console of a murdered teenager's locked van. That was enough for a warrant. Not a conviction, but a direction. The data had finally moved. When the fingerprint match came in, the notification didn't trigger a siren. It landed as a line of data, an automatic cross-reference from AFIS, processed through standard procedure. But that single hit, tied to a recent booking in Kenosha County, unraveled over 2 decades of unanswered questions. The match was to a man named Dennis Brantner, age 64, at the time recently arrested for unrelated drug possession. His fingerprints, taken as part of routine intake, had been uploaded into the national database only months earlier. That was the first time his prints were digitally compatible with the latent print pulled from the cup lid in Barrett Beck's van in 1990. Brantner had no direct ties to Barrett, no shared acquaintances, no reason to have been in her van. That lack of connection made the print more suspicious, not less. It eliminated any plausible social overlap. His presence in her vehicle was now a forensic fact without any legitimate explanation. Investigators reopened every document tied to Brantner's prior history. He had lived in Wisconsin his entire life. No formal violent criminal record, but he had a known history of domestic incidents, including multiple reports involving former girlfriends. None of those cases resulted in felony charges, but the behavioral pattern was enough to prompt a deeper review. One specific arrest stood out: a 1984 case in which Brantner allegedly locked a woman in his vehicle during an argument. The woman escaped unharmed. Charges were later dropped. The details of that case had not been included in any previous Beck investigation. Detectives now focused on reconstructing Brantner's movements in July 1990. Old employment records confirmed that at the time of Barrett's disappearance, he had been working for a trucking company that serviced routes passing through Fond du Lac and Appleton. He had access to the highway corridor. He had the time, and he had the opportunity. Brantner was brought in for questioning, no formal charges, just a conversation. He was advised of his rights. He waived counsel. When asked about Barrett Beck, he said the name didn't ring a bell. When told his fingerprint was found inside her van, he hesitated. Then he denied ever seeing the van or the girl. He speculated that perhaps he had been in a similar vehicle at a car dealership, or that maybe someone had planted the item. His answers were evasive but calm. Investigators noted no visible signs of panic, but his version of events lacked specificity. He couldn't provide a reason for being in Fond du Lac in July 1990. He couldn't account for his exact location during the 48-hour window when Barrett went missing. Forensic evidence alone doesn't always result in an arrest. But in this case, the lack of explanation, combined with the match, was enough to escalate. Prosecutors began reviewing options for a formal charge. Cold cases rarely come with perfect files, but this one had something rare: an unconnected individual's fingerprint inside the sealed vehicle of a homicide victim with no reasonable cause. A grand jury was convened. Witnesses from the original 1990 timeline were recontacted. Investigators cross-checked Brantner's known associates. Several people recalled him being in the area during the summer of 1990, though no one could confirm seeing him with Barrett. A few described him as someone who liked to give rides to younger women, sometimes uninvited. A search warrant was issued for his property. At the time of the crime, Brantner had lived alone in a trailer outside Kenosha. That trailer had long since been demolished, but several personal items had been relocated and stored by family. Among them, a map from the early 1990s, marked in pen with a series of routes, one of which passed within 500 feet of where Barrett's body was found. The evidence wasn't cinematic. No confession, no blood-soaked tool. But the connections were growing. Cases like this don't resolve through spectacle. They move because people persist, and because time, when matched with preserved evidence, becomes a tool instead of an obstacle. For Barrett's family, the update was delivered privately. After 24 years of silence, they were told that the case had moved from cold to actionable. Her father's response was quiet. Then keep going. By early 2016, the Fond du Lac County District Attorney's Office moved forward with formal charges against Dennis Brantner for the first-degree murder of Barrett Beck. The evidence was circumstantial, but anchored by a fingerprint found inside a sealed crime scene and supported by corroborative context built over 26 years. The grand jury returned an indictment after a closed session. The prosecution emphasized one core point: Brantner's fingerprint had no legal or rational reason to exist inside Barrett's van. He was never a friend, co-worker, or acquaintance, and yet it was there, on a drink lid in the front console of the last vehicle she ever entered. Brantner pled not guilty. His defense argued that the fingerprint proved nothing about how the print got there, nor when. The state, meanwhile, prepared a case that leaned heavily on behavioral pattern evidence, geographic overlap, and the timeline inconsistencies Brantner provided during interviews. No one suggested the case was open and shut, but it was viable. Jury selection began in late September. Media coverage was controlled but persistent. Most locals remembered Barrett's disappearance. Many had attended the vigils. The courtroom, though, dealt in process, not memory. The judge issued a gag order to prevent further speculation from interfering with jury neutrality. The trial opened with the fingerprint. Technicians testified to the chain of custody. Forensic analysts explained the evolution of matching technology and why the print wasn't identified until 2014. The prosecution's strategy was to show that the scientific delay did not invalidate the original evidence. It simply limited when it could speak. But beyond forensics, the state needed to establish intent and access. The map found in Brantner's possessions, marked with a route close to where Barrett's body was discovered, was presented. Though not dated, it aligned with his known delivery schedules from his former employer. Several former associates testified that he had frequently driven Highway 49. One noted that Brantner preferred routes with less traffic, describing him as someone who avoided populated rest stops. Still, the defense pushed back on all points. No eyewitnesses, no video, no murder weapon, no DNA placing Brantner at the recovery site. They repeated a single theme. Fingerprints alone don't convict. The state countered with his behavior, the inconsistencies in his interview, the lack of any explanation for being in the van, his previous arrest for forcibly confining a woman inside a vehicle. While not a conviction, the prior case was admissible under Wisconsin's similar acts statute. It suggested opportunity and method. For 8 days, the trial continued. Testimony, rebuttals, forensic diagrams, analyst reports. Then closing arguments. The jury deliberated for 2 full days before announcing a result. No unanimous verdict. A mistrial was declared. The decision didn't absolve Brantner. It didn't close the case. It meant only that the evidence, though powerful in parts, hadn't convinced 12 people beyond reasonable doubt. For prosecutors, it was both setback and validation. They had brought the case this far, but not far enough. Outside the courthouse, Barrett's family gave no public statement. They had waited 26 years for a trial. Now they waited again. What followed was a difficult but strategic decision. The state offered Brantner an offered plea, a legal agreement in which the defendant maintains innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution holds sufficient evidence for conviction. It's not exoneration, it's not a confession, but it closes a case without forcing a second trial. Brantner accepted. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for second-degree reckless homicide. The public response was mixed. Some viewed it as closure, others saw it as incomplete justice. But the family had been clear. They weren't seeking vengeance, they were seeking truth. And even with the limits of the plea, some truth had finally been put on record. After the courtroom emptied and the cameras shut off, the legal system had spoken. 10 years in prison, handed down through an offered plea. No trial victory, no confession, just a documented acknowledgement that enough evidence existed to convict. For many in Fond du Lac, the outcome was functional. For Barrett Beck's family, it was something else entirely. Finality without resolution. The Becks didn't give interviews. They had spoken publicly only a handful of times since 1990. What they pursued over the years wasn't spectacle, it was consistency. Regular check-ins with detectives, support for cold case funding, quiet pressure for DNA backlog reform. Their presence didn't fade, even when the case had. Within law enforcement circles, the case became a training standard, referenced in forensic seminars, used in evidence preservation modules. The cup lid, the unlabeled photo discrepancy, the fingerprint hit nearly 25 years later, each was cited as an argument for retaining physical evidence indefinitely. This wasn't theory, it was precedent. At the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, an internal memo was circulated. Beck case, example of delayed value in latent print retention. It led to policy changes in how trace evidence was categorized for long-term archive. That shift had implications far beyond one murder. The Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Office also adjusted protocol. Cold cases previously tagged as low priority were reevaluated for modern reprocessing. By 2019, 2 other dormant files were reopened. Both had preserved evidence. One led to a new arrest. Barrett's case left no room for symbolic closure, but it added functional value to the system that failed her early. Her story had become part of how justice evolved, not through statements, but through documented flaws corrected under pressure. In the broader public, reactions varied. Some saw Brantner's sentence as inadequate. Others saw it as a reminder of how fragile cases become over time. A murder without witnesses, a victim who disappeared in broad daylight, a crime scene that looked too clean to matter. The only constant was patience. Investigators close to the case often spoke of what they couldn't say in court: the weight of knowing, the frustration of delay, the burden of imperfect outcomes. In interviews years later, one senior detective stated it simply: "We didn't get him on day one, but we kept the file ready for the day when we could." That file, its faded manila jacket labeled BB90, had outlived multiple shifts in staff and 3 generations of forensic standards. But it had also delivered a result, even if compromised by time. Barrett Beck was 18 when she died. She left no manifesto, no record of last thoughts. But the system that investigated her death absorbed lessons from it, quietly and over years. If there's a truth in this type of story, it's this: Closure and justice are not the same thing, but both still matter. By the time Dennis Brantner was processed into the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, the case file labeled BB90 had grown to over 2,000 pages. It contained autopsy photos, crime scene diagrams, forensic lab reports, internal memos, outdated interview transcripts, and media clippings spanning nearly 3 decades. But even with a plea deal entered and a prison sentence handed down, the file was not closed. That distinction mattered. Technically, an offered plea concludes prosecution, but in practice, cases like Barrett Beck's remain open in the minds of investigators, prosecutors, and forensic specialists who study them, the system as a whole. The plea did not answer fundamental questions. There was no timeline of how Brantner encountered Barrett, no detail on how he entered the van, no proof, beyond forensic presence, that he acted alone or with intent. The legal threshold was met, but the factual gaps remained. Internally, the district attorney's office maintained a quiet policy. Evidence from the Beck case would be stored permanently, not cycled through regular purge schedules. That policy soon expanded to other cold cases under a procedural update adopted in 2017. Cases that met 3 criteria: preserve physical evidence, identifiable victim, and incomplete resolution, were reclassified as legacy priority. Barrett's case became the model. From a policy standpoint, her case also informed how Wisconsin law enforcement engaged with advancements in forensic science. The latent fingerprint that tied Brantner to the van had survived because it was collected, preserved, and eventually digitized under evolving standards. Without that process, no match would have occurred. The lesson was clear. Time shouldn't erase potential. This principle led to the launch of an archival review program, an internal effort by the state crime lab to reevaluate pre-2000 physical evidence across all counties using modern protocols. In 2020 alone, 2 convictions and 1 identification stemmed from that effort. The ripple effect from Barrett's case extended far beyond Fond du Lac, but the file still held silence too. No definitive timeline of the crime existed. Barrett was last seen just after noon. Her van was located 2 days later. Her body wasn't found until 6 weeks after that. The total window of opportunity had been narrowed through inference, not direct evidence. Investigators continued to believe the murder occurred within the first 24 to 48 hours. But without a confession, exact timing and sequence remained unknown. Likewise, the forensic profile lacked DNA that could tie Brantner directly to the body or disposal site. The cloth used to blindfold Barrett contained no traceable fibers. The hairs found in the van included a coarse blonde strand presumed to be male, but mitochondrial analysis could only exclude, not identify. That result never advanced. And then there was motive. Brantner never gave one. His prior behavior suggested a pattern of control and intimidation, but not homicide. The plea he entered allowed the state to close the case, but not define why he did what he did. Some detectives speculated that the crime began as an encounter, possibly impulsive, that escalated. Others believed it was premeditated. Without a statement from Brantner or a cooperating witness, those theories remained internal. They never made it to the file. The folder stayed clinical. That structure, evidence without explanation, became a subject of academic study. One university used the Beck file, anonymized in a forensic psychology course, exploring the difference between conviction and closure. The students debated what the evidence meant, but the professors reminded them, meaning isn't required for justice, only evidence. And that's what the file still holds. Not a full story, not resolution, but a record that one case, left untouched for decades, eventually delivered results. A case that shifted how others would be handled. A case that changed how investigators looked at timelines, storage policies, and the long arc of evidence integrity. Barrett Beck's case is no longer cold, but in the structured cabinets of Fond du Lac County, it remains accessible. Not because it has to be, but because it should be. The name Barrett Beck doesn't drift through headlines anymore. There are no yearly updates, no courtroom sketches, no ongoing press inquiries. But her case is not forgotten. Not in the office where her file still sits, not in the labs that change how evidence is kept, and not among the quiet reforms that her story helped shape. In Wisconsin, her case is now part of standard cold case training. New detectives learned not just the procedural timeline, but the sequence of failure and recovery. The van, the overlooked lid, the hair without roots. They study how one missed detail cost decades and how its preservation redeemed the investigation years later. Forensic instructors use her case to demonstrate the fragility of evidence chains, the importance of digital archiving, and the risks of early assumption. What happened in Fond du Lac wasn't extraordinary in violence. It was extraordinary in delay. And it proved that justice doesn't just depend on who did it, but on how well the system holds on to what they left behind. Inside her community, the memory of Barrett lives differently. Her former school sponsors a scholarship in her name, targeted at young women entering technology or criminal justice. Several of her former classmates still contribute anonymously decades later. One retired teacher called it the most complete lesson we ever gave, even if we didn't know it then. Among investigators, there's an understanding. Not every case ends clean, but every effort matters, because sometimes the only reason a victim's name remains in the system is because someone refused to treat silence as closure. The physical evidence in Barrett Beck's case is now stored separately in a locked archival cabinet labeled Priority Cold. It's not touched anymore. It doesn't need to be, but it's not destroyed either, because the lesson is in the keeping. There will always be cases without answers. Some will never be solved, but those that are, those like this one, prove that justice, however partial, is never out of reach if you refuse to discard the past. Barrett Beck didn't survive her journey to Appleton, but her name did. And in the quiet logic of investigation, that's sometimes the only victory the system can offer, and the one it must always protect. Sometimes justice doesn't come in full, but stories like Barrett's remind us why we still keep going, why every piece of evidence matters, why persistence is more than principle, and why we can never afford to forget those who vanish without a voice. As someone who's walked you through this case, I'm not here just to share details. I'm here to remind you that silence is never permission. Every name, every story, every loss carries the weight of change if we're willing to carry it forward. So tell me, what did this case make you feel? Do you believe justice was truly served? Drop your thoughts below, or just let me know where you're watching from. And hey, if this story moved you, even just a little, subscribe to Creepy Crime Stories so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep seeking the truth together.